I think we can get started now. Okay, so hey everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ashley and I'm a senior at NYU majoring in neuroscience. I took the MCAT in June this year and I'm applying for the 2022 cycle. Sim, do you want to introduce yourself? Sim? Okay, I'll just continue then. So I do want to make this topic session as interactive as possible. So please interrupt me whenever you want to, or just tell me to slow down. If you have any questions, please interrupt me. And because if you don't, I'll just assume everyone knows what I'm talking about. And our goal is to help you guys understand as much as possible. And before we get started, I'm going to plug these things in. I'll show you guys this slide again in the end. So the first thing is to please donate to our PayPal so we can cover advertising costs and basically expand our student base so that we could can everyone hear me? Oh, okay.
Yeah, you're good. You're good.
Okay, all right, thank you for letting me know. And our second thing is to please join our Facebook group. This is a great way to make some study buddies, you know, and have a just like an outlet to let go of some stress, just talk to people, make some friends, you know. And if you have any questions, you can always email us at mcat101questions@gmail.com. Okay, so this is an overview of what we'll be covering today. We'll talk about the types of learning, some key terms, and Sim will be talking to you guys about memory. So jumping into non-associative learning, this type of learning is an implicit form of learning, meaning that you are not being taught something by making associations. Non-associative learning either increases or decreases an organism's response to a sensory stimulus after being repeatedly exposed to it. So we'll look into these different scenarios. Scenario one is habituation. Habituation occurs when you tune out the stimulus, so you are being habituated to it. Let's pretend you're in a study room, but the pipe in the ceiling is leaking, so you hear drops of water hitting a surface. At first, the sound might drive you crazy, but eventually you will continue studying and not even notice any more water droplets. So scenario two is dishabituation. Let's say the pipe stops leaking for like 20 minutes, but then it starts leaking again. You will notice the water droplets the same as when you noticed them the first time. So basically, dishabituation occurs when the habituated stimulus is removed, but then presented again. So the organism, you, will react to the reintroduction of the stimulus as if it were being presented with it for the first time. So next up, we have sensitization, which is an increase in responsiveness after being repeatedly exposed to a stimulus. And the organism will react to this with an exaggerated response. So to the right, you can see a lecturer. Let's say that your lecturer, hopefully not me, is doing something really annoying, like clicking their teeth or saying 50 times in the sentence. Eventually, the sound of his teeth clicking or him saying will annoy you more and more, so you're becoming very sensitized to this. Finally, desensitization occurs when the stimulus that you were sensitized to finally does not cause an exaggerated response. So you can still find it annoying, but not so annoying that you want to leave the lecture. So it's really important to understand these terms and being able to differentiate between them. I suggest using flashcards or a Quizlet to really nail these terms and to associate them with examples. So desensitization and habituation, um, they're not similar because, let me see. So the difference between these two terms is that dishabituation occurs after habituation. So you're no longer I guess you just notice the stimulus very strongly, and habituation. Oh, wait, I'm sorry, I got confused. So I guess for habituation, you're just, like I said, you're tuning out the stimulus, so it's not, you don't really notice it, it's not bothering you. Desensitization is when you're not like getting that exaggerated response. So you still notice the stimulus, but it's not like bothering you so much. No problem. So we'll move on to associative learning, which is the process of learning that involves objects, events, or actions being directly connected to each other. So two types which you may have heard of include classical conditioning, which was created by Ivan Pavlov, who is notorious for his famous experiment that we'll talk about later. And the second type of associative learning, which is operant conditioning. B.F. Skinner, a psychologist, discovered this type of conditioning by using mice. So we'll first talk about classical conditioning. This type of conditioning involves two stimuli that are paired such that the response to one of the stimuli changes. So we will talk about some key terms in the context of Pavlov's experiment. His experiment basically consisted of a dog, food, and a dinner bell. The purpose of this experiment was to condition the dog such that it salivated when hearing the bell. So Pavlov rang the bell at the same time the steak was presented. And the dog learned that the ringing of the bell meant that it was going to get a steak. So let's go over these key terms. First up, we have the neutral stimulus. The neutral stimulus is one that doesn't initially elicit an intrinsic response. In Pavlov's experiment, this would be the bell, because if you present the bell by itself at first, like in figure 2, it won't salivate, it'll just be confused. The unconditioned stimulus is one that causes the intrinsic response in an organism. So this would be the steak in figure 1. It causes the response on its own, so salivating. The conditioned stimulus is one that used to be the neutral stimulus, but after pairing with the unconditioned stimulus, now produces the conditioned response. So this would be the bell again. Because like if you look at figure 4, if like once the dog has made this association, once the dinner bell is rang, then the dog will begin to salivate. So yeah, the bell is a conditioned stimulus. The conditioned response is the learned response to the conditioned stimulus. It's basically the same thing as the unconditioned response, which would be salivating. The process of classical conditioning involves 5 components. The first one is acquisition, which is when you are acquiring the new association of the neutral and unconditioned stimulus. Extinction is when the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus are no longer paired together, so the organism forgets that an association is being made. For example, if the dog is presented food without the bell for a long period of time, it will no longer salivate after hearing the bell. Spontaneous recovery is when you all of a sudden present the unconditioned stimulus and the conditioned response is observed. So adding on to the last example, if the bell is all of a sudden presented again, the dog will salivate. Next up, we have generalization. So this occurs when other stimuli that are related to the unconditioned stimuli are presented and cause the conditioned response. So for example, if a doorbell is presented instead of the regular dinner bell, then the dog will still salivate because it has made this generalization. Discrimination is the opposite of this. In this case, the organism has differentiated the conditioned stimulus from other types of similar stimuli. So the dog will salivate in response to only a dinner bell, not any other types of bells. Any questions? Okay. So this is a graph showing the process of classical conditioning. On the X, we have time, and on the Y, we have strength of the conditioned response. As we can see during the acquisition phase, the strength of the conditioned response is increasing as the conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus are being presented together. The extinction phase follows if the unconditioned stimulus is no longer being presented. So the strength of the conditioned response drops and the organism is no longer making the connection that bell equals food. After a short pause, so after a period of time in which the conditioned stimulus or the unconditioned stimulus are not presented at all, so the dog is left alone, we see a spontaneous recovery of the conditioned response when the bell is presented all of a sudden. But it's not as robust as when the organism is first learning the behavior. And it eventually will continue to fall as the conditioned stimulus slash the bell is being presented alone without the food. Does this graph make sense to everyone? Okay, because I have a question for you guys. You can put your answer on the chat. So does anyone want to give it a go and explain their thought process? Okay, I'll go. So the correct answer is A, and this is my explanation at the bottom. So after Timmy was bit by a dog, by a white dog, he now thinks that every white dog or any white animal is aggressive and will bite him. Timmy has made the generalization that any white animal will be aggressive. So he has paired white fur with aggression. And I wrote here that the unconditioned stimulus is the bite which causes Timmy to cry. So Timmy crying is the conditioned response. So white fur is the conditioned stimulus. And what helped me answer a similar question on the real exam was listing all of the unconditioned slash conditioned stimuli and responses on the noteboard. So basically just writing everything down. That way you have like an overview of the question and you can sort of, I guess, piece together and identify what these like what are the specific stimuli or responses. The neutral stimulus in this case would be it would be the white fur before Timmy was bitten by the white dog. So before Timmy was bit, he wouldn't react to any white animal. So the second type of operant conditioning, or the second type of conditioning is operant conditioning. And this is a little bit different because reinforcement and punishment are used. So B.F. Skinner is the father of operant conditioning because he created his infamous Skinner's box. His box was basically his setup that included a rat and a lever that would release food pellets. So the rat learned that by pushing the lever, food would come out. I'm not sure if it was a rat or a mouse, just one of them. So when Skinner shocked the rat intermittently, the rat would accidentally hit the lever, which would stop the shocking. And the rat learned that by pushing this lever, it wouldn't be shocked. So there are two types of reinforcement, positive and negative, and both aim to increase the probability of the behavior to be repeated. So positive reinforcement is when a desirable stimulus is given. For example, food. When the rat learned that by pushing the lever, food was released, it would push the lever more often. Negative reinforcement is when a noxious or undesirable stimulus is removed. So the rat pushing the lever to stop the electric shocks from happening again serves as the negative reinforcement. Important to note here, I got confused on this a bunch. So it's important to understand that positive and negative refer to adding and removing, not good or bad. I don't know if I'm the only one who made that mistake, but I made that mistake. So we'll get into this more later. Okay, good, I'm not the only one. So reinforcers come in two types, primary and secondary. Primary reinforcers are something that is innately satisfying. So food would be an example. That's why I put unconditioned in parentheses, because it's innate. Secondary reinforcers would be something that you have learned to be desirable. So money or stamps that if you collect enough of, you can trade them in for a primary reinforcer, such as food. Opposite of reinforcements would be punishments. Again, there are two types, positive and negative. Positive punishment would be adding something undesirable or noxious to stop a behavior from happening. An example would be giving your child a timeout for misbehaving. Negative punishments would be removing something desirable to deter behavior. So telling your child that they can't play video games after dinner because they were misbehaving. Again, you can read these terms as positive, adding something, punishments, something bad. So positive punishments means adding something bad. This diagram does a better job of explaining it. Does everyone understand? Okay, good. Because I have another question. Yeah, sure. Tell me when you're good. Okay. Again, don't feel pressure to write everything down on the slides because I will be sending everything later. Okay, so does anyone want to explain how they got their answer? Well, everyone seems to be on the right track. Um, yeah, exactly. So my teacher in this example is making me write this long essay about why texting in class is bad. So I'm being given this punishment. And like I said, positive means adding something. So the answer is B. I also wrote my explanation at the bottom if you want to see it later. Okay, so this is a lot of words in one slide, but don't write them all down. Just I will explain them all. So with operant conditioning comes reinforcement schedules. These schedules are crucial because you want to time and distribute your reinforcements to optimize behavior and learning. So different patterns of administration will lead to different results. There are two schedule types, continuous and intermittent. Continuous means that you are giving a reward every time the organism does what you want. So let's say you're teaching your dog to sit and you give a treat every time it sits. With this method, the dog will learn very quickly, but it will also forget this behavior very quickly once you stop giving it treats. Intermittent refers to giving a reinforcement every so often. Using this method, the dog will take longer to learn how to sit, but once it learns and you stop giving it treats, then it will continue to sit for a longer period of time. So the first type of intermittent reinforcement schedules is fixed ratio. This schedule type is defined as administering a reinforcement after a set number of times, so fixed. The organism performs the desired behavior. So basically giving your dog a treat every 3 times he sits on command. Variable ratio, on the other hand, is when you give a reinforcement after an unknown slash variable number of times the organism does the behavior. So you would give your dog a treat after a random number of times that it sits. Fixed interval is when a reinforcement is given after a set period of time. So giving your dog a treat every 30 minutes. Variable interval would be a reinforcement after a random slash variable period of time. So giving your dog a treat after 15 minutes at first, and then the next time would be after 23 minutes. So the dog doesn't really know when you will give it a treat. Does that make sense for everyone? Okay. So this is a graph of the reinforcement schedules. Not sure if you will be asked specifically about this graph. I haven't seen any questions about it, but it's important to understand it. In this graph, the X is time and the Y is the cumulative number of responses. So variable ratio here shows the strongest response because the slope is the steepest, meaning that more responses are observed after a very short period of time. Variable ratio is the best for maintaining behavior because the organism slash the dog doesn't really know when it will be given a reinforcement. So it will do the behavior as much as possible when prompted to. So it increases the probability of getting a reinforcement, or so it thinks. So fixed ratio is almost as robust as variable ratio, except there are these short pauses after the reinforcement is given. If the dog knows that it will be given a treat after sitting 5 times, then it will pause after the treat is given because, or before it starts sitting down for 5 times again. So because it has that certainty of getting a treat after sitting for 5 times, it will procrastinate. Variable interval is not robust at all. So let's say your boss comes to check on you after an unknown number of hours, right? You don't know when your boss will check up on you. So instead of working hard all the time throughout the day, you will work at a slow, steady pace throughout the day so that you don't burn out when your boss checks on you. Fixed interval is kind of like variable interval, except using the example as before, you know when your boss will check on you. Let's say it's every 3 hours. So if your boss last checked on you at 9 a.m. and it's 11:55 a.m. and your boss will check on you in 5 minutes, you will start working really hard in those last 5 minutes so that your boss comes in and sees you working really hard and maybe you'll get a raise. So, but actually you were slacking off for 2 hours and 55 minutes. So that's why you see like this kind of plateau here and then like it starts increasing very rapidly. Does that make sense for everyone? Okay, good. Here's another question. Okay, does anyone want to share their answer? Okay, so you guys are on the right track. Yeah, yeah, that's right. So the question is telling you that this type of schedule is variable ratio. And like I told you, this type of schedule is the best for maintaining behavior. So Sim doesn't know how many tasks she has to complete for her boss to give her a raise. So she will complete as many tasks as possible so that her boss will give her a raise. In her mind, she could complete 3 or 8 or 11 tasks before she gets a raise. Regardless, she's going to work hard. A will only occur if her boss gives her a raise after every task she completes, but then stops doing so all of a sudden. So after her boss stops giving her a raise, Sim will refuse to do any tasks. C will happen if her boss gives her a raise after an unknown period of time, also known as variable interval. So Sim will slack off at times but work steadily. And D will happen if her boss gives her a raise after a set period of time. So let's say it's every month. Sim will work hard only at the end of the month because that's when she expects her boss to give her a raise. Does that make sense? Okay. The schedule that's least effective is continuous reinforcement. So that's when the person, or yeah, that's when a reward is given every time the behavior is observed. So it's great for teaching something very quickly, but it's the worst for maintaining that behavior because, like I said, if you're teaching your dog how to sit and you give, yeah, you thought the least was D. Um, I'm not sure what you mean by you thought the least was D. Right. Yeah. Um, it is the second to least effective, but the most ineffective is continuous because, like I said, like if you're teaching your dog how to sit, you give the treat every time the dog sits, but then you stop giving the treat, then the dog will refuse to sit because you're no longer giving that reinforcement and the dog is no longer expecting a reward. So this is a summary of the reinforcement types. Don't feel pressured to write this whole table down because I will be sending it to you, or the slides. So this table basically just summarizes how each type of schedule works and its characteristics. It's separated in yellow and red. Yellow means fixed schedules and red means variable schedules. So does anyone have any questions about what we talked about? Okay, well, I hope everyone understood. If you have any questions, you can always email us and I will clarify anything. So I will pass it over to Sim.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to talk about memory, and let me just share my slides real quick. Let me know when you guys can see this.
Wait, sorry. I have a question.
Yeah, what's up?
Yeah. So, right, so if you were to compare, like Pavlov's experiment with the like operant, uh, you know, conditioning, like which is better in like teaching, people?
Ashley, do you want to take this?
Yeah. So it's not I guess if you were to compare both and determine which one is better at teaching, I don't think you have to compare them. They're just two different types of learning. It's
Okay.
just both use different methods. So operant conditioning uses reinforcements and classical conditioning is just making associations. So like using, or like, sorry, it uses pairing.
Okay, gotcha. Just kind of like comparing apples and oranges kind of thing.
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
Okay, cool. So for the memory, we're going to be talking about the different memory storages and the types of memory. and how we can retrieve the memory, and what happens, why we forget, and some of the diseases that come with memory, and sometimes why we can't remember something. So in the brain, this is where there's different structures in the brain where they handle different types of memory. You should definitely know the amygdala is known for emotional memory. And it's mostly in the hippocampus for long-term memory. And we're going to go over the different types of memory, so don't worry about that. But I just wanted to show you where in the brain different types of memories are located. So the cerebellum, we also have procedural memory, and the cortex in the brain is for short and long-term memory. Okay, so these are the different memory types that we will be covering. So as you can see, we have sensory memory, short-term, long-term, and then we're able to divide long-term memory up into 2 different parts and divide that up into even more individual parts. So we're going to go over all of this right now. Working memory is also known as short-term memory. So let's start from there. So going over sensory memory, this is really short input. So there's 2 types. Echoic memory is sound, so what you hear. This lasts for around 4 seconds, and you can like try to remember what you heard for that amount of time. And then the second one is also called iconic memory, and this is what you see, and that lasts for even shorter. So it's less than 1 second. So this type of memory is very limited, as you can tell. So it's like things that you get like really fast in your environment. So it doesn't last really long. So this is sensory memory. The next type of memory is working memory, which is also known as short-term memory. So this lasts a little longer. It's about 20 seconds. And the capacity for this is what we call 7 plus or minus 2 information. So your brain can hold around either between 5 to 9 amount of information at any single given time when you're trying to memorize something, and that's called your working memory. So this is like sometimes the reason why phone numbers are around 7 digits, not including the area code, so you can memorize those digits. And this is memory that is stored while it's in your attention. So you're most likely, when you're memorizing, you're using your working or short-term memory. When you're like repeating something, or repetition is usually working in your short-term memory. And then we come to long-term memory. So we actually have like an unlimited amount of capacity that can be stored in your long-term memory. And it might not feel that way, but we do. And it's difficult to always retrieve it, and that's a different thing that we'll address. So the first type of long-term memory that we'll talk about is explicit, which is also known as declarative. And this is something that you recall using your conscious. And this is when, sorry, is there a question? No, okay. This is when you're trying to remember and recall your memory. And there's 2 types. So it can be trying to remember facts or general knowledge, something you're like studying for a test. This is your semantic memory. So like facts, anything that you might have tried to memorize like that. And then anything that you have experienced, that's called your episodic memory. So those are personally experienced events that you recall, like being able to remember like a party that you went to last year, or like a big event. That is in your episodic memory, versus if you're trying to recall like Pythagorean theorem, that's called semantic memory. So that's just like a bunch of facts, like names, locations, stuff like that. And then we'll go on to implicit. So that is like without trying to remember something, but you can remember it. So Ashley just went over the conditioning, and that is one thing that you can remember without any conscious recall. And skills, and that's like brushing your teeth. You don't have to dig through your memory like how to brush your teeth, you just kind of remember how to do it. Do you guys have any questions about the difference between these two types of long-term memory and their divisions? Okay, if not, we'll move along. So I have a quick question. And again, you can just put your answer in the chat and then we'll go over it. Okay. Yeah, so the answer is D. So explicit memory is recalling like your events that you've been to or general knowledge. So D is a good example of trying to remember a past event. Whereas the other ones are examples of implicit memory, where you're checking your email, or procedural memory, which is remembering how to ride a bike. And this is the conditioning that we talked about. Yeah, C is an example of conditioning. Okay, so these are the other types of memories, but we just went through all of this. And retrospective memory is remembering things from the past, whereas prospective memory is remembering to do something in the future. So remembering that you have class at like 7 p.m., or remembering to do your chores before your parents come home. So that's like remembering what to do next, whereas retrospective memory is remembering things from the past. Do you guys have any questions between those two? Okay. And this is kind of like a summary of what we just went through. Okay, so retrieving your memory is sometimes more difficult. So you can always, recognition, you can have like a stronger impact versus recall. So I'll get to your question in a bit, but you can recognize something, but you won't always be able to recall that information or where you got it from. So this is an example. So you can recognize that's your friend, you've seen them before, but you might not be able to recall their name. So some type of recall is serial, free, and cued. So serial recall is remembering a list of items or various events, whereas free recall is you're trying to remember something without a cue. So it's kind of out of the blue. And cued recall is you're kind of given a hint, a cue from where that memory is coming from. And this is also why that relearning is sometimes easier, because it's still stored in your memory and you're just bringing that memory again. And this is why relearning takes less time because you're able to remember the stuff that you have learned in the past, but maybe it wasn't stored in a way that you can retrieve that memory. And this is also where emotion comes into play. So depending on your mood, you might be able to remember that memory a little better. So sometimes in your life, you remember these memories like you feel super confident. Those are called flashbulb memories that you feel really confident about that memory. You're never going to forget it. And emotion may have to do with that. And these are some processes that can help you remember where that memory is coming from. Okay. And yeah, so explicit memory, and yeah, Ashley answered that. Basically, this is what you should know for memory. You will most likely be tested on these terms. So you really want to get down the difference between these terms, the divisions, and types of examples. So I would definitely like try to come up with examples of all of these and try to remember them that way. But beyond this, there's not that much the MCAT would need you to know. Does that help? Okay. Okay, and are there any questions about this slide? Okay, cool. So the next thing is semantic network and spreading activation. So this is when remembering one thing leads to remembering another thing. So this is kind of how your brain organizes that information. So just thinking about one word can lead to a lot of different thoughts. So for example, if you're just thinking about bananas, that might lead you to think about food. Or you might think about color and then you go to yellow and then orange and then color, things like that. Or you can associate bananas with monkeys eating them. You can then think about monkeys in the jungle and animals. So this is how kind of that network is, this shows like the relationship between ideas and how you can remember things. So these are what we call nodes. So nodes are like every one of these is like a node. And they depend on the strength, like how often you use one node and how they trigger another node. So, oh, yep. And they become, oh, oops, how do I go back? Okay. They become activated when you remember something. And this is also called spreading activation, how you see one thing can spread to another. And this whole thing is called the semantic network. Does that make sense? And this is how we remember details about one event. So one event can lead to details about another event, and that's how we kind of think about memory. Okay, cool. So how can we encode that memory that we can remember it better? So I know many times when we're cramming, we've just like put all that memory and hopefully we stored it in our long-term memory. And it's usually there, but we can't retrieve it. So if you guys always like had problems with that, I know studying for exams, sometimes I study and then I go to the exam and I'm like, shoot, I just studied this. How did I forget it? This is because you didn't study it in a way that you can recall that information without any cues. That's what we discussed, like why recognition is stronger than recall. So these are some methods of storing that memory and making it a little stronger so that you can remember it and retrieve that memory when you need to. So elaboration is forming a relationship of that new memory and information to store it in your long-term memory. So it kind of forms a story. So you're forming a story of that new memory to old memory. So thinking about old memories and new memories, you're kind of combining both of them. And then chunking. Chunking is an example of putting the information into categories. So an example of this would be like phone numbers. We don't memorize a phone number in like just 10 digits. We memorize it in like 3, and the last 4 digits. So that kind of helps us to remember that phone number a little better instead of just remembering 10 random digits. And then we've all probably heard of like mnemonics like Roy G. Biv, PEMDAS. Those are just like random acronyms you make up, and they help you remember that larger picture that you're trying to remember. And there's been a lot of studies done on showing images. So if you pair something up with an image, you're most likely to remember it better, just because sight plays a big role in memorizing. So that really helps to memorize new information. And self-reference, this is when you refer to yourself, and so that information is being processed in a deeper level, so you're able to relate to it and remember it better. So you're able to process that information at a better depth and hopefully recall that information better because it's more personal. So these are actually great examples of how to like study and memorize better so you can recall that information when you need to. Does that make sense? Let me know if there's any questions on these. And okay, quick question on resources. Yeah, I put in a slide and we're going to talk about that at the end about how to go through the psychology section. Okay, quick question now. Oh, don't look at that. Okay, cool. Sorry. Here we go. Okay, I think you guys saw that answer, but okay, no worries. Cool. Yeah, so being able to do both is better than doing one. And as we talked about, self-reference is really self-reference is really useful, and you can process it better. And chunking is good, but it's not that it's kind of like less work than making up a mnemonic, because you're connecting a lot of information with that mnemonic. So you're doing kind of more work instead of like chunking is you're just putting that information into a group and memorizing it. Whereas mnemonic, you're kind of thinking of something and just using that. You're putting a lot more effort, so you're able to memorize it better. Okay, so let's talk about diseases. So as you know, as we age, there's a lot of problems with that. So memory, there's also a lot of memory loss that comes with like dementia and just your cognitive abilities. So Alzheimer's is a progressive disease. So as you age, the onset is around 65 years old. So you start to forget a lot, and this is linked to losing a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine in your neurons. And this is why you start to forget a lot, and there's a lot of changes in your mood and behavior, and it keeps worsening, and there's no cure for this, unfortunately. So it starts off with just losing your memory and normal things, and not remembering a lot of stuff. And then another one is Korsakoff's disease, and this is also a chronic memory disorder, but this is also linked to heavy alcohol abuse, and is caused by a thiamine deficiency in the brain. And this also leads to confusion and speech disruption and definitely memory loss as well. So another quick question. Okay, yep. So this is an example of short-term memory loss, where patients with Alzheimer's are not able to progress like into that long-term memory. So short-term memory loss is a really common problem during this stage. Yep. Okay, so interference. So sometimes you're not able to remember things and process them because something else is interfering with it. So proactive interference is when an old information is preventing you to remember something that was that you're learning right now. So when you're learning a new email address, you keep forgetting, you keep confusing it with an old one that you were trying to remember. And retroactive interference is when the new information prevents you from remembering the old information. So once you learn something new, you're having trouble remembering the old password. Let me know if this kind of makes sense, or I can give a better example. So proactive, so when the old information is preventing you to not remember the new information. For example, like you already learned your friend's email address, and then they make a new one, and then you're like confusing it with the old one because you knew that one for a long time and you keep confusing it with the old email address. And retroactive interference is when the new information, you remember that, but then when you go back to use your old email address, you don't remember the password to that. Okay. And one more thing that we're going to cover. So we forget a lot. So the chances of you forgetting actually decrease if you are able to review that information. So as you can see, when you remember, like the first day, you remember around 100% of that information. But just after day one, on day two, if you don't review, you're gonna lose a lot of that information, like around, I'm not even sure, but like it looks like a lot of like 70% of that information, you're gonna forget it. And that's just your retention interval. So your retention went from like 100 to like 30%. But as you can see, as time goes on, from day 7 to day 30, there's not much change. So it levels off eventually. But it becomes harder and harder to remember that previous information. But if you rehearse that information, like the next day, day 2, it goes back up. And then if you rehearse it again, day 7, you don't forget that much. As you can see, there's a little bit of jumps here and there, but you're able to still remember most of that information. So this is really great because this shows you why you should be reviewing your information frequently, and this will definitely help you remember better if you're able to do that more often. Otherwise, you're definitely going to forget a lot. But as we learned, relearning is a process. So the next time you do relearn that information, it will be easier to learn it, and hopefully you'll be able to store it better in your memory. Yeah, it's not good to cram just because it's harder to store that information in a way that you're going to remember it later. So it's good to review frequently, as you can tell from this graph. And here are just some like tips for studying. Just because there's a lot of terms for psychology, you definitely want to use flashcards early on and just go through them and come up with examples for things that you're not able to remember. Come up with personal examples, mnemonics, anything that we talked about really that can help you store that memory better. And remember to review frequently. And we just discussed this, the decay theory, so you don't forget a lot. And we were talking about passages earlier. A lot of the psychology passages have a lot of research-based questions about like variables, graphs. So you really want to practice with those type of questions. And I know a lot of people use the Khan Academy notes. There's 2 documents. There's a 100-page one and 300-page. And I'm really sure that they're really in-depth information, and a lot of people do benefit from them. So if you need some content review, that might be a good point to start. Ashley, do you have any other tips?
Yeah, a lot of people on Reddit say that, oh, like I read the 300-page document once and then like I got a 132 on the section. But do not listen to them, because this section is not about just being like familiar with the terms. You really have to like understand what they mean, associate them with examples, and being able to like apply them to the passage and the scenarios that they give you. So what I did, I think I wrote this in the chat, but what I did was I created a Quizlet of all the terms for psychology and sociology, and I practiced them like every single night. It took like 30 minutes to an hour, but it was really worth it because like I didn't forget any definitions on the real exam.
Yeah, that's great. I definitely think just reviewing a lot for psychology, those flashcards, those are going to benefit you a lot. And even going through like questions that you miss, like why did you miss this? And just thinking, redoing them, and stuff like that is really going to help in this section a lot. Do you guys have any other questions?
I just wanted to add like a pretty good tip, like that helps me.
Yeah, for sure.
So can you go back on the question, like the earlier question with the,
Yeah.
like the Alzheimer's?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, for example, this one, right? So I mean, like it's saying initial stage of Alzheimer's. So I'm thinking, well, we have short-term memory, which is long-term. Now the thing is, episodic, procedural, and semantic are all examples of long-term, while short-term memory, well, is short-term memory. So the thing is, usually what I've actually been able to find on the MCAT is like either 2 or 3 of the answers are actually all the same, while like 1 is actually different. So for especially for science passages, it's actually helpful to have these have these terms like in the back of your head, so you can just basically pick out what is similar, what is different. Because usually, I mean, at least for the science, I'm not sure it's for the cards as well, but definitely for the sciences, whatever is different is probably the answer sometimes. But like, yeah.
Yeah, that's a great tip. Thank you for sharing that. Does anyone have any other comments or questions? Okay, if not, remember to join us on Facebook, and this is a QR code for that, and we'll send out these slides and recording afterwards. And if you are able to, please donate to our PayPal. It would really help us in the long run to continue these free sessions for everyone. And email us at MCAT101questions if you guys have any questions. Thank you, guys.
Thank you for coming, everyone. It was a great session.
Okay. Bye, guys.